Have you ever pictured yourself like way back in time, standing in a crowd and it's like super quiet and you're watching as the king is crowned, but not just any king, a king whose reign will be like full of craziness, like turmoil and revolution and just like lasting change. That's kind of the trip we're taking today. So like we're going to dive deep into the coronations of the first two, King Charles of England and Scotland.
Yeah, it's a wild period for sure. Like
Yeah.
tons of symbolism and intrigue. I mean, luckily we've got some amazing insights from Professor Susanna Lipscomb and Dr. Claire Jackson. Like they've really made this whole era come to life.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Like I was so surprised by how different their coronations were, even though they were both Stuart kings.
Right.
So before we get into like the details about Charles III and this, like, can you kind of help us understand how these Stuart, like, what was their whole deal with coronations? Was it different from the Tudors, like the kings that came before them?
Well, the Stuarts had a tough job. They were basically a brand new dynasty, taking over after the Tudors had been ruling for so long. It's like, imagine James the Height. He was Scottish, taking over after Elizabeth Wright. It's like he had to walk this fine line between what the English people wanted and what the Scottish people expected.
So did he totally ditch the Tudor traditions, or did he try to find like a middle ground?
I think he was actually really smart about it. Like, he kept some of the traditional Tudor stuff, but then he also snuck in some changes, subtle but important. It was like he was connecting to the past,
Ah.
but also being like, hey, I'm in charge now.
Oh, that's interesting. It's like walking a tightrope,
Hmm.
right? Like you're honoring tradition, but also kind of starting this whole new thing. One thing I thought was really interesting was James III's decision to have the coronation oath in English.
Hmm.
Like they usually did it in Latin, right? What's
Yeah.
up with that?
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal. Back then, Latin was still the language everyone used for fancy stuff, like scholarship and the church. By switching to English, James, I was basically making it so regular people could understand what was going on. It was like he was connecting with them, on a personal level.
And James, I loved language and translations.
Mhm.
I mean, he was the guy behind the King James Bible.
Totally. That was a huge project. Like, it changed English culture and religion forever. So you can see how his whole thing with language shows up in his coronation, too.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's move on to Charles the Serf. His coronation was in 1626 during a plague outbreak. How did that mess things up?
Oh, it changed everything. Like, his dad had this huge procession through London, but Charles had to keep things low-key. They had to, like, cut back on all the parties and stuff,
Yeah.
and way fewer people could go.
Man, that must have been a bummer. Like coronations are supposed to be these huge celebrations.
Yeah, it was definitely more serious, and some historians think it was like a bad omen for his reign, like foreshadowing all the trouble that was coming.
Oh, wow. Speaking of the people who were there, like who actually went to these coronations, was it just like a bunch of snooty nobles?
Well, yeah, the nobles were there, but it wasn't just them. People from all different levels of society showed up. Like for James the Cree's coronation, they even had tickets so they could control the crowds.
Really? So it was like a chance for everyone to see this big historical moment.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about being inside Westminster Abbey for the ceremony. They had all kinds of other stuff going on, like parties and celebrations that were meant to get the whole country involved.
Like what kind of stuff?
Oh, parades, feasts. They even had these crazy water shows on the River Thames, and towns and villages all over England had their own parties, like they were copying what was happening in London.
Wow. So it was like this national party. Everyone was celebrating together.
For sure. Okay, so now things get really interesting. Both Charles I and II had two coronations, one in England and one in Scotland. That's a good question. And the reasons were different for each king. Like, Charles I was born in Scotland, so people expected him to be crowned there too. It was like a way of honoring his Scottish roots and making sure everyone knew he was the rightful king.
So it was kind of a power move?
Totally. But it backfired on Charles I big time.
I don't know. What happened?
Well, by the time his Scottish coronation rolled around in 1633, people were already getting restless. Charles III had been messing with the church, like trying to make Scotland more Anglican. But Scotland was mostly Presbyterian, and they didn't like it one bit. They thought he was trying to take away their religious freedom.
So instead of bringing everyone together, his coronation made things worse.
Exactly. It became this symbol of everything people hated about his rule, and that anger eventually led to the English Civil War.
Wow. Okay, so if Charles III's Scottish coronation was about holding on to power, what about Charles II? He had a Scottish coronation first, right? Before his English one?
That's right. He was crowned in Scotland in 1651 while he was still in exile after they executed his dad. It was like a last-ditch effort to get people on his side and take back the throne from the English Commonwealth.
So it was out of necessity, not choice.
Pretty much. And it was way more low-key than a normal coronation. Like, they crowned him at Scone Palace, not in Edinburgh, and the whole thing was super influenced by the Presbyterian Kirk.
So both King Charles had coronations in Scotland, but for totally different reasons.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Okay, let's talk more about Charles I's English coronation. He did some weird stuff, like he wore white instead of the usual purple or red robes. Why?
Yeah, that was definitely different. Some people think he was trying to look all pure and simple. Maybe he was trying to distance himself from his dad, who was seen as kind of a big spender.
So maybe he's trying to say something about how he was going to rule?
Maybe. Remember his dad, James? I wrote a lot about what it meant to be a king, and he thought the monarchy should be more stripped down Charles. I might have been following his dad's ideas.
So he was trying to set a different tone for his reign.
Exactly. But even when you plan every detail, things don't always go the way you expect.
True. Okay, so speaking of unexpected twists, what happened to the crown jewels during the English Civil War?
Yeah.
Like all that chaos.
They were destroyed. The people who took over after the king was gone thought the crown jewels were like symbols of the monarchy, so they had them destroyed.
Oh man, what a loss.
Yeah.
So what did they do for Charles II's coronation? Did he have to go without a crown? No, they didn't skip the crown. Like, they made a whole new set of crown jewels for Charles II. They were super careful to make them look just like the old ones. You know, the ones that got destroyed.
Whoa, can you imagine being the craftsman who had to make those? Like, not only do you have to make these super detailed pieces, but they're supposed to be just like the national treasures.
Right.
And everyone's watching you.
That's a lot of pressure.
Mm.
Okay, so let's jump ahead to 1661. This is when Charles II finally comes back and takes the throne. His English coronation must have been insane, like a huge party.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, his father's coronation was kind of a downer, but Charles II went all out. He knew he had to make a big splash, like show everyone that the monarchy was back and better than ever.
So what did he do? Like, what made it so special?
Well, first of all, he picked a really symbolic day. Like, he had his coronation on St. George's Day.
Yeah.
You know, England's patron saint. It was a genius move. Like, he was connecting his rule to this whole idea of national pride and religion.
Oh, that's clever. Like, he was saying, hey, I'm not just some king, I'm one of you guys.
Exactly. And then there was just the whole scale of the thing. Like, it was super over the top and extravagant, like a total contrast to the Commonwealth years when everything was all serious and boring. He wanted everyone to see that England was rich and powerful again, and that the monarchy was at the center of it all.
So it was like a performance, right?
Yeah.
Like a show designed to blow people's minds.
Yeah, you got it. Charles II totally understood how to use symbolism and spectacle. Like, he was a master of that. From the crazy robes to bringing back the Order of the Garter, even that weird ritual where they touched people to cure diseases. He used every trick in the book to show everyone who was Bosch and to make people feel connected to him.
It's crazy to think that these coronations happened hundreds of years ago, but they still feel so exciting, like we're still drawn to them. Why do you think that is? What is it about coronations that still grabs us today?
I think it's because coronations tap into something really deep, like something that goes beyond the history of it all. It's about power changing hands, about traditions continuing, about all the hopes and anxieties that a country has.
It's like a ritual that we all do together. Like we're all taking a moment to think about who we are and where we're going as a nation.
Exactly. And even though the world is totally different now than it was back in the 1600s, those basic parts of a coronation, like the oath and the anointing and the crowning, they still mean something to us. They tie us to our history and to something bigger than ourselves.
And it's not just about looking back, right? Coronations are also about the future. Like they represent a new beginning, a time for hope and change.
Totally. Like, think about Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953. It was this moment of unity and optimism. Like, England had just gone through World War II, and now it was a new Elizabethan age.
And it shows us that even when things are changing like crazy, some traditions stick around. They make us feel stable and connected to the past, which can be really comforting when everything else feels so uncertain.
Yeah, that's a great point. Coronations are like these markers in time. They link us to the past, but they also point us towards the future.
So as we get ready for another coronation, it makes you wonder, like, which parts of this whole ritual are going to really hit home with people today? What do you think will stand out?
For me, it's the oath. Like, that moment when the new monarch swears to do their duty. It reminds us that even kings and queens have to make promises and follow the rules. Like, they're accountable to the people.
Yeah, there's something really powerful about that.
Yeah.
Like, it's a super serious moment where the monarch says, I understand what my job is,
Yeah.
and I promise to uphold the laws and traditions.
And it's not just the monarch making a promise. It's also a chance for the whole country to reaffirm what they believe in. Like, it's a moment of self-reflection, you know? Like, what
Yeah.
kind of country do we want to be? What values do we want to hold on to?
It's like this national conversation that's being started by this ancient ritual. And in a world that feels so divided and uncertain, that kind of shared reflection can be a really powerful thing.
Totally. It reminds us that even though the world is constantly changing, we're all connected by our shared history and our shared humanity.
Yeah, it makes you think about like how we're all part of this bigger story,
Mm.
right? Like this story that started so long ago and it's still going on. And some people might think coronations are like old-fashioned and out of touch,
Yeah.
but I think they can actually change with the times, you know, like they can reflect how the world is changing.
Oh, totally. I agree. Like, it's all about finding that balance, like honoring the traditions, but also making sure it still means something to people today, like for future generations.
So how do we do that? Like how do we make these old ceremonies connect with people in the 21st century?
Maybe it's about bringing in different voices, like making sure the ceremony includes everyone and represents what our society looks like now.
Or maybe we can use technology, like
Mm.
find new ways to get people involved and make it more interactive.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
like we can keep the core of this ancient ritual, but we got to make sure it speaks to the next generation, like their hopes and dreams.
It's tricky,
Yeah.
like walking that tightrope, but it's worth it. So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into the coronations of those first two King Charles, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember from this whole conversation?
I hope they understand that these historical events were really complicated. Like, coronations weren't just these empty shows, they were planned out so carefully. And they were full of symbolism and power and political games. It's like they give us this amazing look into the past,
Yeah.
not just about the monarchy, but about the whole society and what people believed back then.
It reminds us that history isn't just about memorizing dates and names, right?
Mhm.
It's about the stories and the decisions that people made and how they shaped the world we live in today. And as we think about the future, I hope we keep in mind that traditions like coronations can change. Like they can adapt and still be important to new generations.
I like that. And who knows, maybe the next coronation will be a mix of old and new. Like, it'll be its own unique chapter in this whole long tradition.
I can't wait to see it. So to all our listeners out there, we want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about these historical coronations? What do you think about this whole ritual and how it's lasted for so long? Share your thoughts with us on social media. We love a good deep dive discussion.
And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next adventure in history. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
Happy listening, everyone.